Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today, it's time for another worst to best ranking, yay! Alright, this was one of the more heavily requested rankings for me to do a video on, and one that I absolutely agree is worth the effort to make. Though I'll admit it was by far the most difficult one to put together, and will likely retain that status for a long time to come. The thing about Squarepusher is that he has a very large and varied back catalog. There are so many albums that have so many different appeals, and worst of all, I enjoy the vast majority of them about the same amount. Really only the top and bottom picks are the ones I don't see changing their placement in the ranking depending on my mood, and even so, I do consider pretty much all of them to be worth people's time in some way. But I can perfectly understand if you look up at this man's back catalog and find it intimidating and not want to sit through everything without some sense of expectation of what you're getting into. I mean, I'm personally not averse to the idea of a marathon of the man's entire back catalog and still keep all 13 of the albums I'm about to discuss on my iPod, even when I really don't need to at all, but never mind. May as well get into it, so disclaimers, this is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it. This list is mostly just ranked on my own personal enjoyment, and that's about it. So chances are most people, and especially those more familiar with his full catalog, are going to have a very different ranking from my own. Everyone can have a different taste in Squarepusher, and that makes him all the more worth people's time. And this ranking only includes the main studio albums that I already did full reviews on. It doesn't include compilations or EPs or the Electrac Live album or Solo Electric Bass or Buzzkin or any of the things I covered in the Odds and Ends video. If you want TLDR recommendations from that video, check out Burning in a Tree and the Big Loda compilation, both of those are great. But never mind that, let's finally get into Squarepusher, worst to best. At number 13, we have Do You Know Squarepusher? Yeah, I don't really see this one ever changing its spot unless he releases some total clunker after this. Not only do I think this album doesn't really add anything interesting to the conversation, the live album is pretty much disco plastic again, and the studio album is just a messy mishmash of B-sides from that album, but there's no track in particular that I think really goes the extra mile, or that I consider one of my personal favorites from him. Maybe Mutilation Colony for its weird Ummagumma-style ambient excursions, and the title track I guess is kinda catchy too, but even those are not even close to his highest points. That said, I don't think the album is terrible by any stretch either. It has some cool ideas here and there aren't any outright bad tracks. I think the album is at least okay overall, and there's definitely some value to be found here. But I do undoubtedly consider it the least essential of his main albums, and the one I have among the least urges to return to. Check out if you're curious, but if you skip it entirely, you're not missing a lot. At number 12, we have Shobaleader One, The Demonstrator. This is a weird one in his catalog, really more kind of an offshoot or side project that I'm not even sure I should be qualifying as a mainline album of his, but to heck with it, I gave it a full video, so it's here in the ranking anyways. Jenkinson basically put together this band, Shobaleader One, and tried to make some kind of Daft Punk-esque vocoder-driven lounge pop album with accompaniment from some unnamed metalhead friends of his. That sounds like a really freaking weird side project from an artist mostly known for IDM and drum and bass, and I kinda doubt fans were really clamoring for him to do something like this. But I don't know, I still like it. It's such a unique sounding album with such a weird set of influences that still comes off mostly enjoyable, and Jenkinson's consistent efforts to just do whatever the hell he wants is one of the things I most enjoyed about him. The reason this is so low in the ranking though is because the production is ass. Mixing and mastering has never been Jenkinson's strong point, and this may very well be the lowest point in that department. Some tracks on this thing sound really grating, especially some of the guitar textures, and the whole thing felt like it's missing a few extra layers of polish. And especially after the Electrac Live album also being released under the Shobaleader One name later on, this became a lot harder to excuse. Still have to admire it for its stepping outside the box, and still say it's worth a shot if you think the idea is worth exploring. I'm more inclined to defend it than most. Whoosh. At number 11, we have Damagen Furies. Remember when this almost made one of my year-end lists? Honestly, I still think this album is good, and in some ways an improvement on his earlier album, Go Plastic, which many would consider a classic from him. I mainly think the production on this album is easily its strongest point, and the fact that it's among his best mixed, mastered, well-balanced, and just overall good-sounding releases. It's a really solid album to me, even now, but it's stuck down in the lower tiers mainly because there isn't really anything here you couldn't already get out of another Squarepusher album and better, especially Go Plastic or Ufabulum. And if not for the opener Store Eyeglass, which has become a major favorite of mine, it'd be a mostly forgettable and inconsequential release of his that it'd probably be safe to skip. I like it, but it's kind of redundant, not essential, honestly. At number 10, we have Go Plastic. Oh boy, I'm gonna get shit for ranking this as low as I am. This is a big fan favorite from what I've seen, and I get it. It has kind of attained that untouchable classic status and is a big nostalgia point for a lot of people that were really drawn to the extremity and attention to detail that everything has. And it certainly has its own well-cemented identity in the Squarepusher catalog. Me personally, though, never been all that drawn to it myself. I think it's mostly kind of headache-inducing, hasn't aged all that well, isn't that well produced either, and in general, I rarely feel the urge to return to it outside of the first track of my Red Hot Car, which I love the crap out of. Hell, pretty much the only reason it's above Damn Again Furies is because this one approached the same kinds of ideas first. But I also fully understand that I am likely in the minority on this opinion. I'll still recommend it to people because most people I've seen got a lot more out of it than I did in general, and I still generally enjoy it. I think it's pretty good and has its moments. It can just be a bit much for me personally, and doesn't deliver on the qualities of Squarepusher's music that I happen to enjoy the most. And honestly, I don't put it on that often, so take that how you want to. At number 9, we have Selection 16. Most people are going to have this one ranked lower than I have it, but I have no idea. It hasn't really been cemented as one of the big iconic classics in the Squarepusher pantheon. My main problem with his album is that there's nothing here you could get out of any other albums of his. It's a bit of an incohesive mess that doesn't fit together as well as a whole as others of his could. But I don't know, I still enjoyed the whole thing from front to back. In my review, I call this his acid and jazz album, in that there's a couple of jazz interludes and a bunch of tracks that more heavily lean on an old school TB303 acid squelching, though never really combining the two. But I don't know, while this is another one I don't consider an essential listen, it doesn't have his absolute best material, but it doesn't have any duds either. It's fun for what it is, and I can see it being ranked higher for other people if it happened to be a jumping on point for them and has more of a nostalgia factor. I don't know. Album's not great, but it's good. It's good. Number 8, we have Budokan Mindphone. Ah yes, the mini-album and companion to his Music is Rotted One Note album. Honestly, the only thing getting Budokan Mindphone up as high as it is on this ranking is the first track on here, Iambic 5 Poetry, which, spoilers for those who haven't seen my top 10 Squarepusher tracks video, is my favorite track from the guy ever, and one of my favorite tracks ever, period. So much emotional connection to that track, and to this studio version in particular, not the live version. That said, it does not tonally mesh well with the weird Miles Davis-esque psychedelic jazz outings that the rest of this release has. And as a result, though I like pretty much everything else on the album, too, I'm much less likely to return to that stuff. Still, I love the Music is Rotted One Note style. I think it was well executed here from an individual track basis, and there's no shortage of creative ideas. Just some serious flaws in terms of overall construction and sequencing that I can't sit here and overlook. Worth a shot regardless, and if nothing else, pick it up just for Iambic 5 Poetry alone. At number 7, we have Just a Souvenir. So here we are at the midpoint of the ranking, fittingly with an album I really want to like more than I do, but some people might say I give too much credit. Inspired by some weird, totally not drug-induced daydream, Jenkinson went out of his way to incorporate as many elements from as many genres as he could, all the while retaining a pretty casual and unserious atmosphere. And say what you will about the ideas that went into it, some people could make the case that it's a total mess, but I don't. I think it's paced in such a way that no element gets more focus over another, be it jazz, pop, rock, his usual electronic flares, anything, and it all comes together as a whole pretty well. I think the ideas that go into this album and the execution is really fun and vibrant and colorful as the album cover tries to capture. The problem is, just like with the Demonstrator, the production sucks. Well, it's passable sometimes, but even the best tracks like Star Time 2 or The Coat Hanger are not the best sounding tracks he's ever made, and at worst it's just actively terrible. Anytime he includes this kind of rough, distorted guitar texture, it's just totally blown out and squashes all the other elements around it and prevents this stuff from landing with greater impact than it really should. It's a really frustrating project that has the potential for greatness but is in serious need of better sound engineers. But whatever, I'm still going to give this one more of a pass because of the creativity on display here. It's certainly worth the price of admission. It's definitely worth at least one listen just for the experience, so yeah, check it out. At number 6, we have Ufabulum. I don't think I was always totally on board for this album, especially given how out-of-the-box and strange a lot of Jenkinson's work was in the years previous. The idea of an album that just kind of took his normal style and combined it with the shiny textures of modern EDM wasn't one that sounded all that interesting on paper. But it totally clicked with me when I actually reviewed it. I now consider it among my biggest personal favorites from the guy, and that mainly comes down to one element that I've always considered a big weakness of Jenkinson's in general: the production and overall sound. This album sounds so much bigger and more expansive than most other things he's released, and the mixing and mastering is a giant step up from just a Souvenir and a Demonstrator. It was such an unbelievable breath of fresh air. And even if the idea behind this album may not seem that interesting on paper, he was able to keep me invested in it wholeheartedly from start to finish. The melodies are great, the frantic pace of the less melodic sections is still really fun, and overall I think he really used those more flashy, modern-sounding elements to his advantage. Squarepusher ends up doing EDM better than most artists in the popular consciousness right now do it. And as flashy as this release ended up being, it's one that I really did not give enough credit towards. It's excellent. Definitely worth your time. At number 5, we have Ultravisitor. Alright then, if you were put off by the flashiness of Ufabulum but wanted something similarly well-balanced and well-produced in more of Jenkinson's usual styles, look no further than Ultravisitor. This album, half a live album, but I obviously included it here anyway because the 15 tracks here can't be found anywhere else, shows Jenkinson combining the jazzier elements of an album of his like Music Is Rotted One Note with the noisier and more extreme elements of an album like Go Plastic, and it's absolutely amazing. It has a good balance between more melodic flares and the noisier and more percussive stuff, and while personally the first 4 and last 4 tracks are the best part of this thing by far, falling more in the former department, even in that big noisier middle section, I'm totally captivated by how impressive it is, on top of how good everything sounds and how well executed the atmosphere is. It really feels like a giant achievement, and it's super fun to listen to. Quite possibly the best sounding album in the entire Squarepusher catalog, and if nothing else, don't miss the track Tetrasync, which is probably the most underrated individual Squarepusher track ever in my opinion. Just an incredible epic journey in that one, so yeah, I love this album. Moving on from here, at number 4 we have Feed Me Weird Things. His debut album, the place where it all started. While maybe not an album that's aged the best compared to other Squarepusher releases, the production sounds a little cheap and slipshod, and there's a pretty big reliance on amen breaks, which has kind of become a cliche at this point. But I can't say either of these nitpicks are ones I want resolved. The cheap production actually does enhance this kind of spooky, lo-fi atmosphere the whole thing carries, and the amen breaks, hell, albums like this are the reason why amen breaks became so overutilized. Because they're awesome here. What I love most about it isn't just the historical context, though. I love the jazz elements and the melodies and overall atmosphere of this project. That above-mentioned spooky, lo-fi feel of the whole thing is the main draw of it for me personally, and the fact that there's really not a bad track in the bunch. Well, okay, Future Given is pointless, but aside from that, it's just great jazz-infused IDM from start to finish with a captivating moodiness that I can't really get from any other album in the same way. I imagine some people are going to get more mad at me for not making this my number one, but hey, that's how stiff the competition was for this list, and depending on what mood I'm in, this could very well take that title. Or at least hit the number 2 spot. My actual number 1 pretty much never changes, but never mind. Needless to say, Feed Me Weird Things is an absolute must-listen and a big favorite of mine as well, so go check it out. At number 3, we have Hello Everything. Alright, now we're into the stuff that actually made my favorites of all time list. If you've seen that video, then you already know how the rest of this ranking is going to go, but whatever, let's go into this one. This album's weaknesses may be easier to point out. There's a couple of tracks here that don't fit very well in the overall feel of the album, especially Vacuum Garden. And like Feed Me Weird Things, the production is just kind of average, with percussion tracks often relying on cliched breaks we've heard plenty of times before. But what Hello Everything has working in his favor is the melodies, which are consistently incredible and among his best and catchiest melodic works ever. Maybe a touch poppier than his usual jazzier flares, which I tend to be more drawn to, but it's also bright and colorful and puts me in a good mood better than any other Squarepusher album can, and I don't think there's a single dud in the bunch. There are so many amazing moments on this album that are just an absolute joy to listen to, and I have to give it my full-on endorsement. One of my most listened to projects of his, and one that you should definitely not miss. At number 2, we have Music is Rotted One Note. An album like this may seem like kind of a weird pick to have up so ridiculously high, but this is one of those Squarepusher albums that best exemplifies the thing I most enjoy about him, i.e. his diversity and ability to take riskier moves. And after his first 2 albums kind of showed him putting on this drum and bass jazz hybrid that was uniquely his own, with this one he decided to just make a straight jazz record in the vein of Miles Davis' Bitches Brew Around the Corner, with some other influences from the old avant-garde electronic artists of the 40s and 50s, like Edvard Varese or Stockhausen. And the result is this totally psychedelic and weird experience that doesn't sacrifice its musicality, but isn't afraid to get really disturbing in some areas. Not for the faint of heart, but I think it's absolutely awesome from front to back. The jazzier moments like Don't Go Plastic and My Sound are some of the biggest highlights of his entire career, and the weirder moments like those near the end are super unnerving in the best way, and has among the most memorable endings for a Squarepusher album with Last Approach, even though it's easily the most unnerving and least accessible moments on the album as well. I could go on, but honestly it's best you just go out and experience the whole thing for yourself. The jazz fan in me can't help but love every little bit of this thing. But with that, let's finally get into my number 1 pick, which I'm sure people could see coming miles away as per usual. At number 1, we have Hard Normal Daddy. Yep, it was never gonna be anything else. This is the album that got me hooked on Squarepusher. This is the first album that comes to mind whenever I think about Squarepusher in general. This is unquestionably my favorite album from the man overall. In a lot of ways, this album could be seen as a rehash of Feed Me Weird Things with its mix of Herbie Hancock-style jazz fusion and old-school drum and bass, but to me it's more of a refinement on his first album. It's less focused on being spooky and atmospheric. The jazz elements are a bit more soundtrack-ish, like the Death Wish soundtrack or Lalo Schifrin's Bullet soundtrack. Unsurprisingly, given those are my 2 favorite soundtracks of all time, their influence made this all the more impactful for me. But it's not just the jazzier and soundtrackier moments. There's more aggressive and electronic heavy moments like Rustic Raver and Fat Controller that I enjoy more than most of the stuff he does in this style. And just overall, there's, like I've said with a lot of these, there's just not a single bad track in the bunch. But this one especially. Undoubtedly, this is the Squarepusher album that I've put on the most frequently. It's the one I most recommend to people if they've never heard a Squarepusher album before in their lives. It's basically just the Squarepusher album. So yeah, in my opinion, the man's best work. So yeah, that's the ranking. Of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.